What's going on, Delaware Valley Aggies? I'm Mike Kyle Williams, and I'm here with my co-host,
Taji Hubbard.
and we're here with the Philadelphia Inquirer Reporter, Marcus Hayes. Thank you so much for being here today. Why don't you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a columnist at the Inquirer. I write about sports. I've been doing the job for, 33 years, 28 of them at the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News. I do some WIP stuff for the radio. I've been on TV. Sometimes when big stories happen, the news outlets will call me. So, my background is I've covered the Philadelphia Phillies as a beat, the Philadelphia Eagles as a beat, but in the last 13 years, I've been a columnist, which means I get to cover all the sports, including like the Olympics and golf, and certainly all the Philly teams and all of the sort of playoffs for all the teams and stuff, and then drafts, spring training camp. It's people ask me all the time what I do for a living, and I tell them I steal money because it's like I can't believe I get paid to do what I do.
Yeah.
What do you feel like was the hardest part of your journey, and do you think you're getting close to the end, or like how far do you want to go?
Definitely getting close to the end. As I said, I've been doing it for 33 years, and probably the hardest part, like with anything, it was the beginning, and sort of figuring out, number one, is this an industry I want to be in? Because like yourselves, when you get out of college, you got options, and you have to sort of decide within 4 or 5 years, what is my career going to be? So I was very lucky. I got a good internship coming out of Syracuse University. I got a good job coming out of Syracuse University covering high schools, but covering high schools and small colleges, college sports like at Del Val, which aren't like, Penn State football, you got to work a little harder to get that done. But I think it helped me in the long run because, number one, I really appreciate where I am now. And number two, I had to learn a lot about a lot of different sports, how the business of sports works, recruitment. And one of the things I learned really is that the people who play sports and coach sports and administer sports at Del Val work just as hard and often are just as talented as the people that play sports and coach sports and administer sports at Penn State or the Philadelphia Eagles or the Philadelphia 76ers.
So you said you came from Syracuse. So why did you choose Philly sports?
Well, I got lucky. When I was in school, I knew I wanted to be a journalist, but I wasn't sure exactly what kind of journalist. And the only internship I could get in college my senior year happened to be in sports. But I was always kind of a jock anyway, so it kind of fit. My first internship turned into a job because the guy who was the salaried full-time high school sports writer, he got a promotion. And I was kind of his underling. So they were like, well, you've done a good job as an intern. Why don't you try it as a full-time gig? So that's how I started covering high schools in Syracuse. Lucky, right? That guy wanted to move on. And so after 4 or 5 years, I was like, you know what, I think I've outgrown this position. The really big beats at Syracuse, the men's basketball and football teams were taken by people who were going to be there for a long time. So I started looking around, and I didn't get any nibbles. And I was really disappointed. And then the phone rang one day, and it was the Philadelphia Daily News, and they had a job for a feature writer for sports. And that's what I studied in college. I was a magazine journalism major, and that's kind of what I did best, even as a young writer, is right, like long, sobby stories and stories about human interest and things like that. So the reason they were looking for someone, I got a call from Philadelphia. A guy who had accepted the job, his wife didn't want to leave Kansas and go to Philadelphia. And so he had to back out of the job, and they were going to lose the hire. The company said, you have to fill this slot within 2 weeks. So a week later, I was at the Philadelphia Daily News doing a job I had no idea a job I didn't even know existed in sports before that. And about a year later, I did that job and did okay, About a year later, the guy covering the Philadelphia Eagles full time. One of my jobs was to be his backup. Like when he couldn't go to work that day, I had to fill in that day. And I went to most of the Eagles home games and stuff like that. Well, he developed carpal tunnel syndrome and he couldn't type. So I had to fill in for him for a year and he never came back. He was never able to come back. So again, right place at the right time. But as with everything in life, you know, you have to prepare yourself for the right place at the right time. So when you get your chance, you can have your best chance of success. You're not always going to succeed, but I had prepared myself to give myself the best chance to succeed, and you know, I was able to pull it off.
Going along with that, like, you gotta be prepared to succeed. How, like, what advice would you give somebody in that position where they're kind of like, they're not at the level you're at, but they're in that kind of like not making any money. They're kind of just
at the starter,
the starter's grind part. What advice would you give somebody in that, not even your field, just any
field, right?
Like,
well, one of the things that I was fortunate enough to fall into, and my dad told me when I was, you know, your age, maybe even a little younger, is you're going to be asked to do things you're not comfortable doing.
Yeah.
So don't only do the things you're comfortable with. Do the things you're not comfortable with, and become adept at them, even if you're not expert at them. So, like when I was an athlete, I hated shooting with my left hand, dribbling with my left hand. So the first thing I did every time I played or practiced is I used my left hand. When I played soccer, same thing. I used my left foot. And tangentially, when I was a senior playing soccer, and it was like my third sport. I wasn't a very good soccer player. But when I was a senior, we needed a left wing. And we had a bunch of center backs, and we had a bunch of defenders. Those are the things I'd done before. But we needed a left wing, and I had worked on my left foot to the degree that I could play left wing on a poor soccer team with, you know, not big expectations. Right. As it turns out, we got a foreign exchange student who was our striker that year. We had the best soccer team in the history of the league, and we had in part because we had a guy who could play left wing passively. Yeah. So I prepared myself, never thinking I was going to be even an attacker, much less a left wing. But I prepared myself to the point where I was serviceable, and you could say that's kind of how my career has gone too. Just like I couldn't be a hockey beat writer in 1997, but I would have been serviceable. I'd have been okay, and maybe I'd have figured it out.
You got a question?
Yeah. So, like, what do you think like the most challenging thing is in your prospective career field?
Well, it's just so competitive. Getting information is so competitive now. A lot of guys and women have become sort of their own little media contingent. They'll have their own podcasts, they'll break their own news, they have their socials, and it's difficult to get them to give you something fresh and new, so you're kind of chasing what's already out there a lot. It used to be, 1995, 2000, 2005, they were eager to tell their story. Now they understand that they have the facility, they have the agency to tell their own story. I will say that the ones who understand that professional storytellers may be able to tell a little bit better and get the message out there a little bit more succinctly and clearly and more broadly, they're still really, interested and accessible. But that's kind of the big challenge right now. And the other challenge is sort of having your voice heard, because there's so many voices out there. And I talk to classes all the time about this sort of mushroom cloud of media that isn't really media. It's just sort of noise, and it's not really journalism. It's just sort of takes and stuff. So it's really important for people in my industry, maybe more so than ever, to provide substance and context and make it worth your while to buy our product, as opposed to just sort of like listening or reading a take that maybe isn't as well researched or as well informed.
How do you I saw a tweet from you. You were like, James Harden should be shunned like an Amish person caught with the phone. I just thought it was funny, but it's also crazy that like you're getting paid to tweet stuff like that and put out stuff like that.
Opinionated tweets.
And it's like, I don't know, the profession just seems real interesting. I didn't know it was a thing before she told us about you, so it just seems real.
Yeah,
like, real leisure.
Cool. Has a player ever
Oh yeah,
come up to you like, yo, what was up with that little tweet you had?
Sure, yeah. So when I was, Harden kind of gets it. Like, he doesn't really care about that sort of stuff. Durant maybe doesn't. Like, he gets real sensitive.
Yeah, I can see that.
But
he snaps back at everybody on Twitter. No matter who you are, he's gonna snap back at you. Yeah.
So I'll tell you an interesting little story. So we were on TV, and it was 2001, and the Sixers were in the playoffs, I think against the Milwaukee Bucks, and it was right about the time the most valuable player voting was being held.
Yeah.
And we were talking about whether Allen Iverson should or shouldn't win the MVP award. And my contention was he's certainly worthy, but this was probably even before you guys were born.
Yeah.
Allen Iverson was a very polarizing figure because of his persona, with the cornrows and the tattoos and the attitude. My contention on the TV show was all of that should not be held against him. Voters around the country might have an image of Allen Iverson, whether it's accurate or not. It shouldn't affect whether they vote for him as MVP because he's a basketball player. He's not raising your kids. So I want to say the next day, Allen and the Sixers won that round of the playoffs. And at the end of his press conference, Allen got up from a table like this, knelt back down, spoke into the microphone, and said, "Hey, if any of y'all see Marcus Hayes, tell him he's a bleep hole."
Oh.
And walked off, right? So back then, they would pipe. I was covering the Milwaukee Bucks side of that playoff, so I wasn't in that press conference.
Yeah.
But it was being piped into the media room so we could hear it, even though we couldn't be there. So I heard that, and I'm like, oh, jeez. So I got up, and I walked down to see what the issue was, because I hadn't written about anything about Allen Iverson. I wasn't writing about the Sixers. Well, what had happened was one of his handlers had told him, I said, he shouldn't be considered for the MVP because of his image.
Oh,
Right.
So justifiable angry, but
Right.
exactly the opposite of reality.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was walking down the hallway, and Allen was famous for having what they used to call a posse, right?
Yeah, like an entourage. Yeah.
Big entourage. And it was never bigger than in that hallway that night. At least 14, 15 people, including like the 5 or 6 core guys, are coming at me with Allen. And Allen sees me. And I said, "Allen, what was that about?"
Right.
And he just starts cussing me out, pointing his fingers, and his boy starts pointing his fingers. One of my colleagues pins me up against the wall, makes it look worse than it was.
Everybody,
Yeah, like everybody crowd and
So the upshot was I went to the general manager and the public relations person. I was like, "What is this deal?" They're like, "Well, Allen heard you said such and such and such." I was like, "Not only did I not say that, I said the opposite of that."
Yeah.
And I think that you should clear this up.
Right.
So certainly there's fallout, justified or unjustified. What happens is a lot of times athletes will hear that you said something. They won't read it or listen to it for themselves. They hear about it, and sometimes you whisper down the lane, it's not accurate.
It's turning something completely.
exactly.
Sometimes it's totally accurate.
Yeah.
Like Steve Smith and Jerry Jeudy a few days ago, they had their conflict, and that was Jerry Jeudy not appreciating what Steve Smith said, and Steve Smith, going off again on Jerry Jeudy. So sometimes it's totally accurate, but in that instance, it wasn't accurate, and it's just an interesting dynamic to the job. But again, just like missing birthdays and being tired all the time, and not being able to be there for holidays, it's part of the job. And again, I feel like I'm stealing money. It's all of it. This is not a complaint. It's just an observation.
How much?
No, sorry. Do you feel like it's easier to communicate with coaches or players, or do you have a preference?
At the beginning, it was easier to communicate with players because the coaches were old.
Right.
And now I'm old.
Yeah. Now all the coaches are younger than you.
Yeah, a lot of the coaches are younger than me.
Right.
So it's easier to communicate with the coaches because just, one of the big things, it's really interesting in Philadelphia where we are right now with our athletes, okay? Arguably the 2 biggest names in Philadelphia right now are Bryce Harper, the baseball player, and Joel Embiid, the basketball player, which is no shade at Jalen Hurts.
Yeah.
But those are the 2 guys who are probably the biggest deals in Philadelphia. Certainly the guys who've accomplished the most, right?
Yeah.
Both of them recently became fathers. And each of them, I've seen changes in their personalities. So most of the players that I cover aren't yet dads. Just because they're younger, 24, 25, 27. I mean, if you're 30 years old and playing professional sports, your second or third contract, and it's, if you're a dad, you're a young dad, you're a young husband, that sort of thing. So I have a lot more in common with guys who have grown or growing children than I do and women too,
Yeah.
who have grown or growing children, because
Yeah.
our industry, both on my side and on the administrative side, I have a lot more in common with them just because of our life experience. I'm on my third home. I've been married for 20 years. I have 2 kids in high school, that sort of thing. That's very uncommon for an athlete to have. But I will say that, like the athletes, the reporters are sort of at the mercy of the administrators,
Yeah.
the GMs and the press. So we're sort of on this side of the fence and they're on that side of the fence. The owners and the GMs are over there, the athletes and the reporters are over here. So that will always be true. And, we advocate for the athletes more than anybody else does. I mean, everybody thinks that the athletes are rich and privileged and sheltered. Nobody's richer than the owners.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris Rock said it best. He says, Shaq is rich, Jerry Buss has wealth. So there's a different level of existence above the athlete, and I think reporters are sympathetic to that, and I think the athletes appreciate that.
For somebody like me who kind of really has no idea what your day looks like on game day, can you walk us through like where you sit at a game to where
Sure.
how you even get in the position to where you is? Like,
So I went to a Flyers game on Tuesday. So before the game, I go through security, and I go to an elevator, and that takes you all the way up to the very rafters above where everybody sits at Flyers games, because hockey, the press boxes kind of look down on the ice so you can see it well.
Okay, yeah.
And so I sit there for 3 or 4 hours, then I'll go down to the locker room after the game, then I'll come back up and write my story. Baseball, kind of a different deal. The game starts at 7 typically. You get there around 2:30 or 3 because the clubhouse opens at 3:30 for like pregame interviews, and then around 4 or 4:15, the home manager will talk to the media about that day's lineup, what's happened lately, whatever pregame stuff.
Gotcha.
And then the same thing happens with the visiting clubhouse. So you get time in there. So you actually get to the ballpark about 4 hours before the game even starts. Then the game starts at 7. You watch the game. After the game, you go down to the clubhouse and the locker rooms again and do your thing all over again. So you might get out of there by 11. So it's about an 11-hour day for baseball. Basketball, also with hockey, there's a skate. It's like an hour during the morning where the guys like install the game plan for that day. And so you go early, then leave, then come back. Basketball, same way. They have a shoot around. You go early, they install the plays for that day, get loose, get any treatment, and then that's around maybe 11 o'clock. And then for basketball, you show up around 5 for a 7 o'clock game. And there's some pregame availability for the two coaches in the 2 locker rooms. Game starts at 7, ends at 9. You're out of there by about, 10:30, 11 o'clock if you're lucky. And what's the final? Football. Football's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I played that.
Because
Definitely, crazier.
So the idea, the best idea is to get there at least 2 hours before the game, because then you beat the tailgaters into the parking lot. And there's a lot of pregame stuff preparing for football. There's so many players and so much stuff you can do. So I like to get there and get at my desk, get my computer set up, get all the websites open I want, get my story ready to go, and then maybe I'll go have some lunch, talk to some people, do some stats, and then the football game takes 3.5 hours. Then you go down to the locker room, and that probably takes longer than the normal, of the other sports. So you're lucky if you get to a football game at 11 for a 1 o'clock game. If you're leaving by 8, that's a pretty good day, having written your story and everything. And that's the other thing. You write your story as the game's going on usually. So it's very distracting. You tend to miss stuff, You tend to be like, oh, I didn't see that play. So you're going back on the play-by-play, and you're hoping to catch up, or maybe you get a replay or something like that. So as you're writing, especially for basketball and hockey, which happen at night when deadlines are tight, as you're writing, you have to kind of write. You gotta watch, write. And sometimes you're writing about something that happened in the first quarter, like somebody got hurt, or there's a crazy shot, or a goalie got beat 3 times in the first period, and you're writing about the goalie, and there's 2 more periods to go. But then most of the time you're writing about something that's happened in the last 15 minutes of the game, because most of the games are close.
Exciting,
right? So all 4 sort of major sport protocols are different, but they're all very similar in that you get there much earlier than you think, and you leave a lot later than you think, and there's like a hour period of just intense deadline pressure where you're trying to not only get it right, but be funny or clever or
just have personality to it to
exactly.
make it stick out. Yeah.
So it's I remember Allen Iverson, who I'm referencing twice here. He used to say, "Y'all can't do what I do, but I can do what you do."
No, you
And I would
can't, right?
I'd be like, "Go ahead, you got 30 minutes."
Right.
Go ahead. You got 30 minutes. Give me 650 words.
Yeah,
see if you can do what I do. But he's right. I can't do what he does. He might be able to one day do what I do. But it's really a you know what it's like. It's like not being an athlete. It's like being a thespian, like somebody who does plays every night.
Yeah.
Like you're sort of out there. You're putting together a product, and it's not the same product every night. But there's no real competition. It's not like being an athlete and you're competing against another guy who wants to like defend you. You're sort of presenting what you're presenting for the public to judge, I guess, or to digest.
This kind of goes in like more the advice side, but like when stuff got hard, you were making any money. How'd you know like, all right, this is exactly like I'm going all out with this right
this
here?
is what I
like,
want to do.
What made you know like, all right, this is it. This is what I want to do?
I didn't. I mean, there were plenty of time. Like my dad was a construction worker and a farmer. And when you're 21 years old, there's a lot more money in construction and farming.
Coming from someone that age, it's like, yo, it's so much more.
There's a lot more money, but also by the time he was 60, his back was shot. And I still have calluses. I still have calluses from cinder blocks and shovels, and but these calluses are 40 years old. They ain't new. You don't get any calluses, flying business class on American Airlines. But I didn't. I knew I wanted to not do that. But I also knew that by the time I was 30, like something had to break.
You had to be somewhere in life.
Or there's you sell real estate. There's plenty of jobs outside of like newspaper writing and reporting in media. Like you can become a public relations person. You can become a professor. Like I got my, you can become a teacher. I got two degrees at Syracuse when I was there. I was halfway done, and I had a bunch of AP credits, so I was a year ahead. So I picked up an English major, and so I could be an English teacher or maybe an English professor if this didn't work out. So to answer your question, you never know. And like I'd say probably half the people by the time they're 30, half the people who get in this business when they're 22, by the time they're 30, they've realized that maybe they're not good enough, maybe they're not in a good situation. They're in a situation where they got married and they have to do something they had to move and there's no jobs where they've moved to, in journalism. So you just don't know. It's
take that leap. You just faith. I know I can do it. If I put my work in, it'll
pay off. And even if it doesn't pay off, it's a wonderful preparation for anything else you want to do. Because everything you do in journalism prepares you for pretty much everything else, whether it's finance, whether it's law school, any advanced degrees, other industries. If you're a journalist, you sort of have to be able to do a lot of things and understand a lot of things and adjust, and that does prepare you if you need to pursue a second career.
So, like, if you weren't doing this, what do you think you would be doing?
I honestly think I'd probably be an English teacher. Yeah, I really enjoyed when I was growing up. The reason I wanted to be a writer is because I love to read. And whenever people ask me, hey, how do I become a better writer? I always tell them become a better reader. Read stuff that's difficult and interesting and dense and well done. So if I wasn't a writer, I would probably try to teach, I love written word. I would probably try to project that love of the written word on young people like yourselves or younger, and say, like, this is a world that can be open to you, and this is why I loved it. So that was kind of my plan B.
How was the so like, say you're writing a paper on literally what's happening right now. Are there like people lined up next to you doing the exact same thing, or is it just?
So the room we're in would probably hold, probably 40 people. That's about how many people are in most press boxes, most days, writing at the same time, or doing some sort of writing. Maybe not exactly writing about that game, but some people working on longer stories, like they'll be writing about, like, the pitching staff over a long period of time, or a certain kid. Like the Phillies have this kid, Orion Kerkering, who's an interesting kid, and you probably have to watch him pitch 3 or 4 times and go down there 3 or 4 times. But I'd say a third of those people in the press box are actually writing about that day's game and that day's issues. A third of them are electronic media who are waiting for, who have gotten stuff before the game or waiting to get stuff after the game. And about a third of the people are sort of ancillary people who are sort of doing big picture stuff and not necessarily focused on that day's game, especially if it's like baseball, basketball, or hockey. Football, it's probably half the people are writing about that day's game because there's only one game a week.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say, like, Instagram accounts like Bleacher Report, House of Highlights, they go to people like you for the information they repost, or do they?
Well, the aggregators, it's an interesting sort of issue for us. There are a lot of people who make a lot of money aggregating stuff, and there's 2 ways to aggregate. You can aggregate by paraphrasing what we write or report, and even attributing it, but not linking us to it.
Yeah, so it's just this is
So
like, this
they're
is what
just
they put
stealing
out.
the information.
Yeah.
Even if they say, like, Marcus Hayes reported such and such and such, now if they link it, it's much more digestible, it's much more acceptable to us because there's a chance that the person will click on that link and, monetize that information for us if they provide that link. And so, and it's not, it's not just Bleacher Report, and Bleacher Report in particular does some of its own reporting. It does some of its own content. But the aggregators can be a blessing and a curse. I guess there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah.
But it's much better if that publicity drives it to something you can monetize, because what we do, it'd be like, saying, hey, I don't know, this is a good example, but hey, this recipe is awesome and I liked it, don't go to this restaurant.
Yeah. Speaking of publicity, did that Allen Iverson thing help you in it? Like, I feel like that was me.
Did that make you did that have you blow up?
Well, it was pre-Twitter. And
so
pre-Instagram.
Like
it was 01.
So like the word of mouth wasn't as
right. So you heard about it on radio and you heard about it on TV, and it probably did raise my profile. Not that I intended it to, but it probably did raise my profile. But had it happened had it happened 15 years later,
like today,
it might have been a much bigger deal. For me, and it's not something I'd seek, but the reality is if something like that happens, especially if it gets out that I didn't do anything wrong, it makes me kind of look good, right? But there are plenty of people in the business now, and by the business I mean media in general, not necessarily in my sort of like structured, accountable business, who will say outrageous things or do outrageous things to get that reaction from an athlete or an agent or a front office person to create conflict to promote themselves.
Do you think? You think? Like, I feel like your career blew up with the emergence of technology. So do you think that kind of helped you, or do you think if it was still like if you started off, I guess say you somehow were born earlier and you were typing and it was all getting produced by newspapers, you think it'd be better to work in that, I guess, age of technology
or this era?
Now?
I have definitely benefited from radio and television and social amplifying my profile.
So this era?
In this era. That is to say, people who did my job before me and didn't benefit from that would have benefited just as much. I mean, the people that come, especially in this town, we've had some spectacular columnists and writers and just wonderful. So they would have benefited just as much. They would have blown up just as much. And I'm not sure. I like to think that I would have achieved what they achieved in their era. I think that my body of work sort of stands on its own. I don't have anything to be ashamed of. I mean, I'm not the best ever, but I'm certainly good enough to warrant the jobs that I've had. But and it's weird. A lot of people know me by my Twitter handle. It's InkstainedWretch, @InkstainedWretch, and that's something that baseball writers like to call themselves because baseball writers write the most of any of the sports writer breed, and like we're writing 2 or 3 stories every day, 200 days a year. So it's 600, 700, 800 stories, and you just feel like you never stop writing, like the scribes of old who would like translate the Bible or transcribe things, and they literally be become ink stained and hunched over and wretched, and that's the background of my Twitter avatar, like a scribe dictating. But I said that to say it's a pretty clever Twitter moniker, if I do say so. But a lot of people know me as Inkstand Wretch and not Marcus Hayes, just because that's my Instagram and Twitter. You know,
you can't complain. Any type of publicity is.
That's right. That's right.
You can't be
So
mad.
like, how does your course load, like your workload, increase as like teams get further and further to like maybe like the playoffs, or like how the Eagles went to the Super Bowl last season?
Right.
Like how much does the work increase?
Well, it really increases when not the football teams so much, because they still only play once a week.
Exactly.
But what happens is, like, when the Phillies just finished their run, from like the day the Phillies got in the playoffs, I think I wrote every day except maybe 2 for 25 straight days.
Jeez.
So, which is what the beat writer does normally. Like, that's their job, to write every day. But the columnists only write like 3 times a week.
Right.
So my workload doubled or tripled, and I had to go out of town 3 or 4 times unscheduled.
Right.
So again, I'm missing birthdays, and I'm missing soccer games and stuff like that. But again, it's part of the gig. But your workload, once the playoffs happen, it really does blow up. And the Sixers, thank goodness, they keep getting beat by the Celtics, right? So it's a really easy trip.
Right, yeah.
I don't have to go to Cleveland in the air or Atlanta in the air. Right. So I can drive in Brooklyn. They're playing Brooklyn, so I'm driving. Mm-hmm. But the same thing with the Sixers the past few years. I think they've been in the playoffs now for 5 straight years. Yeah, and the farthest I think I've had to fly is Miami. So
they pay for you when you travel.
We have a travel budget, an expense account, and stuff like that. It's not you try to keep it as low as possible, and we have ceilings. You're not traveling first class, and you're not eating filet mignon, but you're also not staying at
5-star hotel.
You're not staying in 5-star, but you might stay in a 3-star hotel. You don't have to stay at like Motel 6 or with your cousin or something like that. You have an expense account, and you need to live comfortably. So you can be a human when you get to the arena, like well rested and well fed, and not sick and stuff like that.
Are you allowed to build relationships with players?
Yeah. You have to. You just do. Like, there's a guy named Hugh Douglas now who's a local radio personality on WIP, but I covered him his entire time with the Eagles, and you just get to know him. You see him every day. I mean, when you're a beat writer, we say this all the time. You might as well marry the guys you're covering or the guys on the beat, because you're going to see them more than your wife. And you just do, you form, and they're not always great relationships. Sometimes there's guys that just, and here's the other thing people don't want to hear, but it's reality, right? If you've been on a sports team and you're honest about the people on your sports team, there are going to be people on that team you hate. Even on your own team, right? There's going to be people you despise. There's going to be cliques. There's going to be whatever. So this idea of like these sports teams having to be in perfect harmony and friends with each other and everybody's pulling for each other all the time, that's a fallacy.
Yeah, I feel like you need the kind of like the people that like even the fights and stuff. It kind of builds team.
But conflict is not always a bad thing. I said that to say the same thing is true with a bunch of writers that travel and the writers that are around the team all the time. Yeah. It's just human nature. Not everybody's going to like everybody. Yeah. You try to be professional, but there are some guys that are going to like you more than others. Yeah. There are some guys, one of the big delineators is, I find, that guys from the South, whether they're teammates or reporters or whatever, there's like a kinship. If you're Southern, there's like that.
Yeah, that is true.
It's
if
like,
you go to the South, everybody, you see it in the superstore or supermarket, you kind of...
Yeah, exactly. It's something there.
Yep. Yeah. So there's or Texas, if you're from Texas. Yeah. And Californians tend to get along real well. And if you're a reporter from Texas or California or from the South, you also tend to benefit, I think, sometimes from that just like shared cultural experience. Yeah. So maybe it helps you as a reporter.
Kinfolk.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's my parents are from the South, so I understand the concept of aunts and uncles and cousins that aren't. They're not really,
not really, but
but they might be closer than your aunts and uncles or brothers and sisters sometimes. So that's an area where, and it's true of reporters and it's true of front office people as well. Like, you have relationships. Humans are humans, and we're going to interact like nobody is uniform. There are guys on beats who cover teams that almost everybody doesn't like, but nobody is universally hated. Exactly. There's guys on beats that almost everybody's going to like, but nobody's universally loved.
The only thing that's kind of confusing me about the job, I guess, is how do you, like, say I saw your paper and somebody else's, how would I kind of compare to see, like, which one is better?
Well, that's the thing. Like, it's kind of like a restaurant.
Yeah.
Like, you have to go in and taste it before you know which one's good. And the one might not look as good as the other, but might actually taste better.
Yeah.
So what we try to do as writers, what I try to do especially, is let you know what you're going to get is quality every time. You're going to get my best shot.
Yeah.
You're never going to, your toast is always going, the butter's always going to be melted on your toast, and your hamburger's always going to be hot, and there's never going to be like salmonella in the chicken, right? And hopefully you'll develop a taste for that. But the reality is, like, you might have like lots of different. Nobody eats Italian every night, right? So you have to understand that people are going to try to sample other writers. People are going to try to see what other people are saying, and there's a lot of good writing out there. That's a great thing about being in this area, especially. You know, you've got New York people writing about Philadelphia. You've got DC people writing about Philadelphia. You've got national people from, you know, California writing about Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is hot right now. So it's really cool to be part of that that sort of biosphere and contribute to it. But the reality is, you know, if Sam Farmer from LA is going to write something about Philadelphia, it's going to be pretty good. If Jason Stark from The Athletic is going to write something about the Phillies, it's going to be pretty good.
No matter what.
You know?
So it's kind of like once you get to that level, everybody's paper is going to be good.
Yeah.
Whatever one you prefer, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, kind of. So that was the infamous Marcus Hayes. You have anything you want to say to kind of let the people leave with?
Well, I got to tell you, I've really enjoyed my time here at Del Val. It's right down the street from where I live, and I couldn't be happier that such good stuff is going on at such a cool place. And it was great to meet both of you guys.
Thank you, too.
And best of luck.
Thank you.
All right, thank y'all for tuning in.